for that. Now let's move back in time a little bit and to 2018 and Syria. And there was an alleged chemical weapons attack took place in Douma. The Foreign Office at the time released a statement, and this is what they had to say. These are very concerning reports of chemical weapons attack with significant number of casualties. An urgent investigation is needed. We call on the Assad regime and its backers, Russia and Iran, to stop the violence against innocent civilians. The Foreign Secretary and Acting Secretary of State agreed that based on current media reports from those on the ground, the attack bore hallmarks of previous chemical weapons attacks by the Assad regime, and so on. Now, in 2021, then, a statement of concern was published on the OPCW's investigation of the Douma event. So this is the Office for Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. And the statement of concern read, "We wish to express our deep concern over the protracted controversy and political fallout surrounding the OPCW and its investigation of the alleged chemical weapons attack in Douma, Syria in April 2018. Since its publication by the OPCW of its final report in March 2019, a series of worrying developments has raised serious and substantial concerns with respect to the conduct of that investigation. These developments include instances in which OPCW inspectors involved with the investigation have identified major procedural and scientific irregularities, the leaking of significant quantity of corroborating documents and damning statements provided to UN Security Council. It is now well established that some senior inspectors involved with the investigation, one of whom played a central role, reject how the investigation derived its conclusions, and OPCW management now stands accused of accepting unsubstantiated or possibly manipulated findings with the most serious geopolitical and security implications." And there was a call on the Director General of the OPCW to address the problems. And this was signed by a host of people, including Noam Chomsky, Daniel Ellsberg, Professor Richard Falk, Tulsi Gabbard, Catherine Gunn, and so on. You can see the list on screen at the moment. Now, I'm glad to welcome Piers Robinson to the programme. We've heard from him already at the beginning of the programme. But Piers, you have been working with the whistleblowers from the OPCW for quite a number of years now, and set up a group called Berlin 21, or at least is involved with a group called Berlin 21, that is trying to sort of continue to keep the pressure on this issue with the OPCW.
Yeah, I mean, just to correct you, I've been working with Berlin Group 21 and Jose Bastani, who is the first Director General of the OPCW, Professor Richard Falk, Hans von Sponeck, former Assistant UN Secretary General, essentially not working with whistleblowers, essentially representing the issues which have been raised by the body of evidence which emerged from the controversy over the Douma investigation. And, you know, this was an alleged chemical weapons attack. 43 civilians were found dead in an apartment building in Douma in Syria in 2018. It was followed up by airstrikes by the British, French and American governments. And essentially at that point, it was presented as part of what had been, in a sense, a well-established mainstream media narrative on Syria, that the Syrian government was systematically carrying out chemical weapons attacks against its population. Now, there had already been a lot of controversy over these alleged attacks, and people, for example, the Ghouta 2013 attack, where a large number of civilians were killed, where many people argued, and Seymour Hersh as well, the American investigative journalist, that this was actually carried out by opposition groups and not the Syrian government. Now, what has happened over the course of the war in Syria is that there have been repeated occurrences of alleged or allegations of attacks and events occurring, and the OPCW fact-finding missions were set up to investigate these and were putting out reports over a number of years. And then with Douma 2018, I think that the bottom line, and to keep it simple, is that the manipulation and distortion of these investigations, which have been going on for many years, essentially to try and point the finger of blame at the Syrian government, became so obvious and so extreme in the case of Douma 2013 that people involved in the investigation started to, as it were, blow the whistle on it. And that has really been sort of what I've been involved in with, certainly with BG21 for the last few years, is really erasing those issues and putting those issues through to the OPCW, to the states parties, British, American, French governments, and so on, and saying, look, here you have very credible scientists involved in an investigation calling out fraud. Okay, this fits into a broader sort of narrative that you have promoted for many years, that the Syrian government is to blame for the chemical weapons attacks. And here you have inspectors saying that this investigations have been distorted in order to point in that direction and not actually get at the truth. And so what you have here in the broadest sense, if you think of Iraq and weapons of mass destruction and the well-established deceptions in that case that we know a lot about now, you have the same kind of playbook operating in Syria, where Western governments co-opting and corrupting OPCW investigations, working with opposition groups on the grounds, have been able to fabricate and build this narrative of chemical weapons attacks. Some of these events involving real deaths of civilians and real use of chemical weapons and so on, but not in reality or factually attributable to the Syrian government. So this is a very big issue, and this is a very big deception, which the Douma controversy points to. And as you can see in the statement of concerns which have been issued, the body of evidence demonstrating this is very, very strong, as well as insiders, OPCW inspectors blowing the whistle on this as well. And this issue, as I say, has been continually put. The response throughout has been two strategies carried out by the British, French, and American governments in tandem with senior OPCW management. And that has been to smear the people raising questions as conspiracy theorists or disinformation activists. It's one strategy. The other strategy is simply not to respond, to refuse to respond to the very clear questions which have emerged from the issues raised by the scientists. One tiny little example, if you'll forgive me the detail on this, is that there was a toxicology report conducted by NATO chemical weapons experts, which concluded that the civilians in Douma were not killed by chlorine gas. Okay, and this was the allegation that they were killed by chlorine gas. And that was actively suppressed by the OPCW across the course of a number of reports. And so that's a little example of quite how serious the manipulations have been. And this year, the Berlin Group 21, we issued a report, and it went to all the states parties, a 50,000-word report documenting all of the leaked information, all of the testimony from OPCW persons about what had been going on. And this was put to the OPCW by the Brazilian government in the UN Security Council, and they requested clear answers to the questions raised. The questions have been raised again at the OPCW Conference of States Parties in November of 2023, and yet again in December at the UN Security Council. Brazil has raised questions about irregularities and so on, and the response is zero. They are just trying to sit this one out. And so, this is part of the work which particularly Hans and I, as part of Berlin Group 21, we are just continuing to pass on the report, put the report under the noses of diplomats, think tanks, and so on, and hoping that at some point there will be a reasoned, rational response from the OPCW senior management and the British and French and American governments, and a willingness to own up to what has been going on. I suspect because of the geopolitical realities that they're wedded on, they're stuck on this particular train they're on, and it's very difficult for them to get off it. This is, I think, part of a broader geostrategic narrative to discredit, delegitimate the Syrian government in order to justify a regime change policy as part of the 9/11 regime change wars.
Sorry to interrupt, Piers, because it's not just Syria, is it? Because as the statement of concern says, this is about Russia and Iran as well. And of course, here we are, years following effectively the end of the Syrian conflict, and we're still banging war drums against Russia and Iran.
Yeah, all of this. Syria as a case, and as a case of sort of strategic deception, fits into the context of the regime change wars that we have seen since 9/11. That itself was a self-inflicted wound to get these conflicts rolling, to get them started. And as we know from documents which have come out, Chilcot Inquiry, for example, but other people such as General Wesley Clark, it was very clear that there was detailed plans for overthrowing a whole series of countries. And Iran was always the end point in that regime change war policy, which was initiated at the point of 9/11, having been planned beforehand. And that's exactly where we are. All of these years on, the deceptions rolling on, and it is about essentially these, some would describe now, desperate drives from the Western military industrial complex, whatever you want to call it, to continue this policy and to continue the belligerent engagement in the international system as a part of shoring up our power and influence, or the West's power and influence. Yeah. So it's very much part of this bigger geopolitical picture. And as with the case of 9/11 itself, the sooner Western publics fully wake up to the level of deception and manipulation, then the sooner there's some possibility of significant pushback against Western governments. And, we are getting closer and closer to that point where if we have major escalation in the Middle East, if they go for Iran, if the neocons get their way, and we have war with Iran, it's very unlikely that China and Russia will stand to one side in that. And, difficult with the younger generation today who've been sort of anesthetized to sort of the level of conflict in the international system. This is an extremely dangerous point in time. And us going a regional war in the Middle East, expanding, and then Russia and China becoming involved, that can head to very, very dangerous and dark places. Yeah. Not definitely what's going to happen, but we would be it would be naive not to recognize the dangers implicit in that. So yes, the OPCW issue very much fits into this broader network, and for sure, I mean, I obviously have been involved in researching and writing about this, and also with Hans and BG21. It is a case where the evidence is there. It's very, very solid. There's very little room for alternative interpretations. A bit like where we are now with Iraq and weapons of mass destruction. We've got the evidence on that of what was going on, etc. Same goes for 9/11, and the same goes for what's been essentially created as part of trying to overthrow the Syrian government, a major strategic deception, and so on. So, for people who like the details, the evidence is there, and the people, Hans and I in particular, but also I think OPCW persons who have raised issues, whistleblowers and so on, no one's going to let this one go.
Okay, Piers, I'm going to say thank you very much for that. I just wonder if you've got just 2 words on this. If we look at this example of the OPCW, but then we've also got the World Health Organization and other UN institutions that are effectively being co-opted to pursue a Western agenda. Do you think the UN can come back from this?
Yeah, I mean, these parallels are important. And this, if people read the statement which BG21 has just put out on its website, and Hans and actually Professor Richard Falk have got a book coming out on the United Nations. And of course, both have been heavily involved, and Hans was an employee of the United Nations. What we have here is another piece of evidence of the corruption and co-optation of our international organizations. We've seen it with the COVID response. We see it every day in the geopolitical context. Can it come back from this? I'm really not sure. I think the institutions are very corrupt. I'd say that there is a possibility that with sufficient pressures and so on, and maybe what we're seeing in Israel and Gaza at the moment, that will create some kind of drive for accountability, which will restore some credibility, or at least be an example of this is how the United Nations is supposed to work, that might be able to give the UN an opportunity to come back. But, unless it deals with issues such as the OPCW and Syria, I mean, persistent corruption and manipulation of investigations to keep a war going, unless that's dealt with, I think it's, people who argue that these institutions are fundamentally broken and not working, I think that argument is going to remain persuasive. So I think, so in short, there is a way back, possibly, but, I think it's going to have to do a lot of work to restore its own credibility. The way the United Nations itself is getting caught up in the ridiculous disinformation narrative, for example, as well as, as we said, the COVID issue and the pandemic preparedness agenda. This all points towards co-optation of these organizations by powerful actors, particularly the West, but also, and it's an open question to an extent, other major powers in the international system. One of the problems we have is that I think that all governments are tempted by these technologies of control and manipulation, whether it's censorship or pandemic preparedness and so on. And so it's tempting for all powerful actors to sort of run with those agendas. And in a sense, what you need and what the UN should be is it should be there for the peoples of the world. That's what it's supposed to be for. Yeah. And, that's going to be a long road and a very hard road, I think, sort of rebuilding the UN so that it is properly functioning as a voice in order to represent the people of the world rather than powerful elite groups.
Yes.
But, never give up hope, I would say.
Okay. Thank you very much, Piers. Thank you very much for joining us today. That is really useful. Now, let's move on. If you like what the UK Column does, you would like to support us, please head over to community.ukcolumn.org. We'd be welcome as a member, and your membership very much needed. Please also consider the shop. We have stuff for you there as well. But please do share anything on the various platforms, especially ukcolumn.org and ukcolumn.extracts.co.uk. And Debi's blog is now up on ukcolumn.org if you would like to have a look at that, focusing on the MHRA, as you can see on screen there. We've got the doctrine of the Lesser Magistrates being discussed with Mark Anderson and Matt Truella. That's on the website. And although it's not there yet, it will be immediately after the news. We have the first episode of the new series, The Health Revolution, with Clive DeCarlo, that went out on Thursday. Yesterday. That will be up later on. Debi, very briefly, an event happening in Cornwall.
There is Cornwall Rising Up. Please do join me. I'll be definitely going on 4th of February between 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock, St Austell Rugby Club. Please book a place, Stannery 2.0 at proton.me.
Okay, thank you, Debi. And